So we're continuing in the fairy tale of David, which, if you've been paying attention the past few chapters, haven't been much of a fairy tale. And I'll be picking up here in chapter 15. And what happened prior in chapter 14 was just a fulfillment of the punishment for David's sin, and there was a very sad story about one of David's children being murdered by another son, and just a lot of the consequences directly dealing because of David's sin. So then when we pick up here, the primary character in the prior chapter was Absalom. So we're picking up here in chapter 15. So after this had happened, that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses, 50 men to run before him. Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. So it was, whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, that Absalom would call to him and say, "What city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who had any suit or case would come to me, and then I would give him justice." And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. In this manner, Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Now it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I made to the Lord. For your servant took a vow while I dwelt at Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord indeed brings me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord." So the king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigns in Hebron." And with Absalom went 200 men, and invited them from Jerusalem. And they went along innocently, and did not know anything. Then Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gileonite, David's counselor, from his city, from Gilah, where he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy grew strong, for the people with Absalom continually increased in number. Now a messenger came to David, saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." So David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise, and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us, and suddenly bring disaster upon us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." And the king's servants said to the king, "We are your servants, ready to do whatever my lord the king commands." Then the king went out with all his household after him, but the king left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. And the king went out with all the people after him, and stopped at the outskirts. Then all his servants passed before him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men who had followed him from Gath, passed before the king. Then the king said to, I looked this up earlier, I think it was Ita, I can't remember, the Gittite, the leader of the Gittites there, "Why are you going with us? Return and remain with the king, for you are a foreigner, and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today? Since I go, I not know where. Return, and take your brethren back. Mercy and truth be upon you, or be with you." But Ita answered the king and said, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be." So David said to Ita, "Go and cross over." Then Ita the Gittite and all his men and all the little ones who were with him crossed over. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. Then the king himself also crossed over the brook Kidron, and all the people crossed over towards the way of the wilderness. There was Zadok also, and all the Levites with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And he set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had finished crossing over from the city. Then the king said to Zadok, Carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. But if he says thus, I have no delight in him, here I am. Let him do to me as he seems good to him. Then the king also said to Zadok the priest, Are you not a seer? Return to the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you, Amahaz your son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. See, I will wait in the plains of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. Therefore Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and wept as he went up. And he had his head covered up, and went barefoot. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and went up weeping as they went up. Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now it happened, when David had come to the top of the mountain where he worshipped God, there was Hushai the Archite coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, If you go on with me, then you will become a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I was your father's servant previously, so I will now be your servant, that you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. And do you not have Zadok and Abiathar the priest with you there? Therefore it will be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall tell to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Indeed, they have there with them their 2 sons, Amahaz and Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. So, I thought about not reading the whole chapter, but then I couldn't figure out how to get the context for each little bit. So anyway, that's chapter 15. So we have God's promise of the consequences for David's sin being carried out here. Absalom, David's son, is seeking to overthrow his father's kingdom. And if you read the first 7 or 8 verses, if you ever want to know how to usurp authority and speak lies and just kind of pilfer away the God-given authority of the king, that's a pretty good picture of that. He gets up early, he goes to the gates, he takes the place of David, who's not at the gate, and he steals the people's affections. So he steals the hearts of the men of Israel. And then the thing, it's pretty obvious that David had other plans for Absalom. When he named his son Absalom, the name means father of peace. So Absalom did not live up to his name birthright in the intentions that David had for him. And so I sometimes forget, because of the conspiracy and just the wickedness. He joined this to his own father. And in verse 14, this part in the chapter kind of hits rock bottom, and David just comes to terms. He says, David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste and depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword. He's talking about his own son seeking to destroy him, and it saddens my heart that because of that. However, during the same period of time, David had written Psalms chapter 3, and it's his prayer to the Lord when he was fleeing Absalom. And you can see in this difficult circumstance, the Lord was still encouraging David, and there's a couple of instances that stand out that I'll try to point out here as we continue on in the chapter. But just to read chapter 3, where it says, The Lord helps his troubled people, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. And David says, Lord, how are they increased who trouble me? Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, There is no help for him in God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill, Selah. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. Selah. And as I read this continuation of just the destruction of David's kingdom and his children turning away, and the sin is running rampant here, it's easy to get discouraged, and you can kind of contrast that with your own life. Everyone has different circumstances, but there's always difficulty. There's always struggles. But it's so important to remember we are. Who was it? It was one of my children the other day. Was asking about a soul. What's a soul, Dad? And it was a good reminder to me. We have the part of us is going to live forever, either with the Lord or separate from Him, and having the eternal spiritual outlook at the forefront. It kind of it puts into perspective God's eternal plan, and the steps it takes to get to His plan are not easy. They're not always pleasant. But I'm reminded back in 2 Samuel, I think it's actually 1 Samuel. Yeah. Anyways, David had said when his son had passed away with Bathsheba, he said, "I will go to him. He will not come to me, but I will go to him." And David had that perspective. There was life beyond this earth. He was living for that. He was following the Lord in that difficult circumstance, and he recognized that wasn't the end. That's not what he was living for. But how he lived getting to the end was the important thing. And there's a verse in Hebrews 12:28. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. So the path and the life we live, we will be receiving that eternal kingdom, but we're commanded to have grace, serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. So how we live out that life and how we carry out that walk is the important thing. And as we read here in verse 17 through 22, there is some, I think, from doing a little bit of research, I think they were actually mercenaries, the people from the Gittites who were from Gath. Who remembers another famous person in the Bible who was from Gath? Yes, Kent? Goliath. Right. And what significance did David have in Goliath's life? He ended his life, right? Right. He ended his life. Yeah, that's true. So these particular people, they had every reason. Well, we don't know the context, but it said those 600 people appeared to be from Gath, and their leader was Ittai, I believe, the Gittite. And it's significant to me, I think, that Absalom and a lot of his close, and so David's son, here was David's son out to destroy him and usurp his power, and he was gathering up the people of Israel, stealing their hearts. And here's this man from another, who wasn't an Israelite, who had every reason to hate David, and yet the Lord was using him. And to me, it's almost like a picture of the Lord in our lives. In reading Romans 5:6-8, if you put the place, it says, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person some might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates His own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And this man, Ittai, the Gittite from Gath, he says, or David says, you just got here yesterday, you don't even know who I am. Why don't you go back? You don't have any allegiance to me. Why don't you stay here? It would be better for you. But Ittai answered the king and said, as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or in life, even there also your servant will be. So I don't know, there isn't any other reference that I'm aware of that gives the background to why Ittai was so vested in seeing David through and protecting him. But even in the utter betrayal of David's son, God still used people that you would think would have no part in God's plan to encourage David and to protect him and to help him carry on. And I'm pretty sure Ittai would know that the backstory, David was not a perfect man. He had obvious open sin that the entire nation knew about. And in spite of that, he still was willing to stand up and protect him. Just as Christ died for the ungodly, while we were still sinners, Christ was willing to pay the ultimate price, just as this particular general of his men from Gath was willing to do also. And that just ties in with communion. I mean, everything ties back. We have communion because Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, God sent his only son, and the immense, unbelievable love for the lost. And Jesus was willing to take up that cross and walk as a man, sinless, perfect, suffer the humiliation of dying on a cross, and was risen again. Because of that, we have that fellowship through communion, and it's just I think this particular man, Ittai, was just a picture, a representation of what God did for us and God's care for us. And continuing in David's life, when other people had rejected him, God's plan wasn't going to be thwarted. God was still watching for David's care and concern and provision for him.